Live from Drearburg, this is the Locked Tomb Podcast. I'm Amy.
And I'm Mel.
Today we are rereading Gideon the Ninth by Tamsin Muir. Actually, we're just in general rereading it. That's this whole podcast. It's not just today.
We're rereading it multiple times.
Yes. Today we'll be covering Gideon the Ninth, chapters 32 through 35. We start out here. It's pretty chill. Now that Harrow and Gideon are BFF and also in love. We start out with Pal and Harrow working together to get into a lyctor lab. And then shit really goes down. Teacher dies. The bone servants die. Marta Dyas dies. Naberius Tern dies. Silas and Colum die. So I think it's kind of a net positive. Ianthe becomes a lyctor. Let's get started.
We also get to know Ianthe a little bit, which is a wonderful moment. Before we dive in,
oh no,
Amy, I've got to ask, how do bone constructs on the ninth house make decisions?
How?
Jointly.
Oh my god. Mel, that one's good.
Thanks. I tested it on my parents because I'm home visiting them, and my mom cracked up, which it's a low bar, and my dad smiled, so I knew it was a hilarious one.
Wow. Congratulations. Did you give them any context? Do they know you're doing a podcast about gay necromancers?
They sort of know that, although I don't think they fully understand. And basically, I don't just let these jokes live on the podcast. I actually adapt them and tell them in real life. But instead of saying anything related to the ninth house, I just transition everything to skeletons. I'm like, how do a bunch of skeletons make decisions together? And so, it hits in a different way, but it's still funny.
Nice. I finally convinced my mom to read these books, so...
What?
Because she wants to listen to the podcast. I was like, Mom, you gotta read the books. So, Mom, if you're out there listening, hi, and happy Mother's Day. All right, let's start it out with chapter 32. The 6th and the 9th are hanging out. They're working together. They do this thing where basically Palamedes, I guess, has not a photographic memory, but the necromantic equivalent of that. He's able to analyze the structure of a thing. And so he knows down to the atomic level how something is made if he's touched it, if he wants to, I guess. And so he held Dulcinea's key to this one door that they hadn't been able to open yet. And he knows exactly how it's formed, but he can't form bone the way that Harrow can. So the way that they open this door is Harrow uses that mind reading trick from the first trial.
But it's not technically mind reading, it's borrowing perception.
Right. Sounds like mind reading to me. They make a perfect copy of the key working together. Then they have a really, really cute moment. Palamedes is like, I did not think that would work. Masterful work, Harrow. And Harrow's like, congratulations to you too, Warden.
It's so cute. I love it.
Yeah. This ends up being, I believe, this is Cassiopeia's lab. She was the one who was working on the bone servants and teacher and the other priests. So they explore this laboratory and we get another "it is finished," which is interesting. It comes after this little note that says 500 into 50, it is finished. This is probably referring to 500 souls being stuffed into 50 bodies.
So there's a great description of the space, and we learn a little bit about the challenge that Palamedes had to complete as well, even before we get to that note, which kind of sheds light into those 500 into 50. Mm-hmm. But the first thing that I thought was funny was, from Gideon's perspective, the room is a disaster when they walk in. It just looks like there's shit everywhere. It's like a total mess. And Camilla just makes a little noise, kind of judging, I think, the space and how messy it is. Mm-hmm. And Gideon knew immediately that Camilla organized Palamedes and her socks by color and genre, which I thought was just like a funny... A funny thing. Gideon's not the brightest, but is just a really funny, joker. I don't know.
Yeah, she's really tuned in, and I feel like she's very observant and can read people pretty well.
Yeah. So when Palamedes is describing the challenge that he had to do related to this, I actually had some confusion around how it worked, and I knew it was a psychometry challenge.
Mm-hmm.
So basically what he says is that the challenge itself was fine, but trying to figure out what it was telling him or what the point of it was a whole other thing. And basically it was a room with a table, a locked box, and a single molar. And of course, Harrow immediately assumes this has to do with reconstruction, which is funny because as kind of a bone adept, she's just used to creating skeletons from a molar, right? Mm-hmm. And reconstructing the larger body that it used to be part of. But what it actually was, which is kind of funny, is that Sextus had to find the construct, well, what he assumed was a construct that was missing a molar in the house. And then that construct had Sextus make a mold of their clavicle, which is funny. And then that clavicle unlocked the box.
Yeah.
I was just so confused the first couple times I read this because I couldn't quite understand how a clavicle mold was unlocking this box.
Well, I think it's just like that this very specific clavicle from this very specific bone servant was the only clavicle that would fit into the keyhole of this box, which I assume was clavicle shaped. I feel like the challenge here was not like, it was like a riddle.
Right.
He wasn't really learning anything from the riddle. It was revealing to him that the servants were not actually bone constructs. That's what you learn from doing from like solving this little riddle. It's just a silly little riddle.
Because there's nothing in the box.
Well, right, because someone had already gotten the key. That someone being Cytherea.
Oh, I see. Which would have led them to her room?
No, this is not her room. I'm not entirely sure why she wanted this key and the key that she and Harrow split. And I think even maybe one more key. I guess the one that's in Abigail.
The key to her, the key to her room.
Yeah, and so I don't know why she was like, let's do these specific challenges and take these keys. I don't know what she didn't want them to find in here, but I guess she didn't care that much because she ended up giving it to Silas. Maybe it was all just for show.
Yeah, or just to trip people up, slow people down.
Right. They're looking through this binder of people's pictures, and then they see a picture of teacher. And there's a little note saying that John Gaius, God, confirmed that this was the best choice for making this soul amalgamation that is teacher. I do wonder, because all of the other pictures are looking quite stern, and then the picture of teacher, or whoever the body of teacher was, is smiling, and I wonder if that's part of why they chose him. And if that's part of why he's still kind of jolly. It's like a little bit of his original soul seeping through.
Yeah.
But it looks like there are 100+ souls in teacher. I'm a little confused, Mel, about why the bone servants are skeletons and the priests still have their bodies. I also don't really understand why the priests aren't even more powerful than the lictors.
I have a couple theories that are unsubstantiated, but something that I was thinking about when I was reading this is that it seems to me that they were created for a really intentional purpose, and that was not to be lictors. And so I don't know. My one theory about why the priests and the bone servants are different is just that the priests actually have more souls in them than the bone servants, and that maybe that then preserves flesh in a different way. It's a total guess, but in this chapter, there's a description of all of these pins that are swirling around these other white pins, and they're different sizes. And I interpreted that to be a visual representation of how many souls needed to go into each person. And so it's unclear to me if anyone had, I mean, they all had flesh at one point, but did that flesh deteriorate over time? Or were they totally defleshed?
Yum.
And their revenants attached to the physical shell?
I guess, yeah, no, now that you say that, the bone servants are just revenants attached to, I think, what was presumably their own skeleton.
Right.
And then the priests alternatively are not revenants. They are just a bunch of souls squished into one body, kind of more like a lyctor.
Mm-hmm.
But lyctors have a primary, just one mind controlling, and then one soul fueling.
Right.
Whereas the priests are like every soul takes up equal space. And so there is no room for a sort of individual or one driving force. These, 100+ souls are all molded together and they don't really have enough individuality to make decisions. Although I assume, and we kind of see this at least Teacher, and I assume the other priests too, is incredibly powerful.
Right.
They're really powerful necromancers.
Right. But somehow limited by these boundaries that we can't necessarily see. What's curious to me is what the timeline is of the creation of Teacher, because I'm wondering if he wasn't created for the sole purpose of guarding this place. I'm pretty sure he was. I feel like that was said at one point.
Yeah.
And it's Anastasia who is writing here that says confirmed, independently highlighted, best option, where Teacher's photo is circled.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think at this point they already know that they have to leave and that they can't come back to this place.
Right.
And so they create Teacher. It's a different way that they create him than Lictorhood, but so that he can live forever with the sole purpose of managing this space and not doing anything else. Because he has some independence and independent decision-making capabilities, obviously, but it's almost like he's programmed where, he can't go down into the laboratory.
Right.
And he can't leave. So there's something holding him there that we can't see.
Yeah. Teacher's a bit of a mystery. And I think it's interesting because I feel like Teacher was both an experiment as part of their search for lictorhood and also was like a thing unto himself. They also created him. But that lictoral theorem is like one part of the eightfold word.
Right.
So it's kind of part of the lictoral process, but he was also created as a servant to watch over the first house when they left.
Yeah.
And while they're kind of reading through this stuff, the fire alarm goes off and they rush to the kitchen, find that the fire alarm was set off because the stove was on fire, because all the bone servants have collapsed. First, they go to check on Dulcinea. They find that one of the priests is dead next to her, and she's like, I didn't do it. And they leave her, go to the priest's quarters, find a pile of bone servants and one priest outside of Teacher's room. They go into Teacher's room. They find Marta Dyas of the second house very dead in a pretty gross way. And Teacher mostly dead. Although I guess Teacher and the priest were dead technically for a long time.
Right. Just a different kind of dead, maybe, as we continue to see over and over again.
Yes, death means many things.
I think this is another section where until you read all the way through Harrow and the short story in the back of Harrow that is from Judith's perspective, that this scene doesn't really hit home.
Yeah.
Like, you have to get through that and reread it to understand Judith in this moment, and also to really feel a lot of empathy for her, because she was in love with Marta, spoiler. And even though they didn't actually end up having a sexual relationship, there's deep love between them, and she had to watch her die. And I think she says in here, no necromancer should have to watch their cavalier die, which again is some foreshadowing for what happens at the end of the book.
Mm-hmm.
But this is a sad scene.
Yeah.
Because it reminds me of how just no one wins when there's infighting. Everyone's doing the best they can with the information that they have and the morals that they follow in these books, and they're not all working towards the same end. But I didn't really like Judith when I first read this book.
Me neither.
I found her so annoying. But after, again, finishing through to the end of the paperback version of Harrow, I actually ended up really liking Judith and understanding where she was coming from and being like, yeah, girl, call for help. Shit is going crazy. And I feel like this whole time she probably feels gaslit. Like she's looking around and she's like, why is no one else calling for help? You know?
Honestly, I think about this every time I read Gideon now. It's like, I don't really understand why. I guess maybe like Palamedes I feel like especially Palamides. I'm like, why is he so anti-calling for help? And maybe he's just so smart that he can kind of like see that that's not what they should be doing, but it completely, like they're getting killed by monsters.
Right.
And they have no way of communicating off planet. And I assume that these people are pretty used to being able to communicate throughout the whole system pretty easily.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden they're cut off. They're all dying in these really horrible ways. And no one wants to call for help except for the second?
Right, because they're all nuts. I mean, Harrow says to Judith, which I thought was a great example of how different they are and how different they think about things, where Harrow says, you're never going to know the full story. It's almost like Harrow's will to keep going here is to just understand the puzzle. And I think similarly, Palamides is also such an intellectual and just has this thirst for knowledge and information and also wants to solve the puzzle. Mm-hmm. And Judith is like, y'all, we're dying. I don't give a shit about the puzzle. We need help.
Yeah, which I get. And it turns out the puzzle is leading them to this awful thing anyway. So
right.
I like understand Judith. And I don't know if at this point she's in love with Marta, because she's definitely in love with Coronabeth, right?
Sure.
But she had to watch her best friend, companion, someone that she may have like previously also had romantic feelings for, but regardless is super close to, die in this horrible way. And she like doesn't let them help her. Yeah, I mean it's
tragic.
Yeah, she's really like needs to chill out, but also I do feel bad for her. I mean, she's like very intense military kid, only knew this like one way of being, and was just trying to do. Are we like Judith stands over here?
Maybe. Maybe.
I don't know.
Also, interestingly, when I first read this, I read Judith to be way older than she actually is. And I mean, I think part of that is the way that Moira Quirk does Judith's voice. Mm-hmm. Somehow, I just read that as older. I listened to that as like, oh, she's an older, wiser, kind of like of that generation that doesn't want to change, Yeah. But no, she's like 22.
She's a kid.
And so again, that also puts this into perspective. Right. I mean, they're all so young.
Yeah.
And they're going through this really intense trauma.
Yeah. There's also a couple of really interesting lines in here. One that I really like is that Harrow says that Teacher was a prototype for something. I think that Judith is like, Teacher was the bad guy. Teacher was doing all these horrible things. Mm-hmm. And Harrow's like, no, he's not. He was a prototype for something. And so this is what I thought the first time, or like a couple times into reading this, I thought that Harrow might be unknowingly referring to Alecto.
Yes.
Because I think this is widely accepted within the fan community as a theory, but Alecto is a resurrection beast and basically the amalgamation of the 10 billion souls of everyone who died in.
Yeah.
I mean, I feel like that's...
I think the most agreed upon... There's many different theories, mm-hmm. but I think that's the most agreed upon theory.
Yeah, and I think it's fairly heavily implied many times that is the case. And when Harrow says this, I was like, oh, maybe Teacher was a prototype for Alecto, but that's not true, because Alecto would have already been around. So basically, this stuff that they were doing, that all of the lictors, or like pre-lictors were doing, was all stuff that John had already figured out.
Right, that's why he's such a shithead.
What a dick.
But maybe they were trying, I mean, I'm going out on a limb here, but maybe they were trying to figure out if Alecto could be not necessarily cured, but not a monster. And so perhaps they were on a smaller scale recreating what Alecto was at a smaller scale and seeing what happened there.
Right.
I don't know, because Teacher's not a monster, even though he's packed with like 100 souls.
Yeah, he's just kind of this like...
He's like a nice, funny old man.
Yeah, pseudo-robotic soul melange.
With really funny jokes.
Yeah, and like a really weirdly dexterous dad bod. Or granddad bod.
Exactly.
Then there's a really interesting part where Teacher kind of comes back to life. I mean, this is why I feel like he's kind of this weird... He wasn't dead. He wasn't alive. He's still not really dead, but he's, incapacitated at the very least. But he says through the sword that's through his throat, he says, "Oh Lord, 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 one of them has come back."
Yeah.
And I read this as a lyctor has come back.
Yeah, Cytherea is here, basically.
So he did know.
He knew. And he didn't do anything about it because maybe it wasn't programmed into him to do anything, you know?
Later on in this section, actually, Cytherea says, Palamedes is like, "Didn't teacher recognize you?" And Cytherea is like, "Maybe he did. Who knows what he was thinking? He was just too many souls to have. Whatever we have as individuals."
Yeah. Really interesting mechanics here. If there's anything I hope for in maybe the fourth book, I love a prequel, you know? Like, I want to see more of everything that was leading up. I mean, we're not going to get a prequel per se, but just more information about everything that led up to the creation of each of these people, you know? And I would love to know more about Teacher. That would be fun.
I would love that too. Hopefully, even if the books don't cover it, there will be extra materials that Tamsin Muir releases later.
Right.
I do love that Gideon is very small. We're on the first house. It's a very narrow look at this world. And then in Harrow, the world was really expanded and we're like, wow, we're actually living in this much bigger universe that we didn't understand.
Totally.
And then just from reading, even at the end of Harrow, that last epilogue or whatever, and then reading the excerpts from Nona, you can see that it continues to expand. The world just gets bigger and bigger and bigger in each book. And even if things aren't explicitly stated, I feel like the more information we get about how the world works as a whole, the more we can infer about the resurrection and pre-resurrection. And I really like that. I like the expanding. I think it was kind of a bit of a jolt going into Harrow from Gideon and being like, whoa, this is a huge world. And I think it'll be the same thing going into Nona.
I mean, it ripples outward. Structurally, it's fucking brilliant.
Yes.
And what's funny is usually I'm someone that really wants a lot of context before getting into the details. Mm-hmm. And Tamsin Muir flips that and is like, here are all the details and you have no context for this at all.
Yeah.
And it makes for a really fun read, obviously. And the fandom around these books is because you're trying to figure them out even after you've read them, and that is a blast. But it ripples outward, and that's what makes these books so fun, is there's always more to explore. You know, you don't start knowing everything, and it's great. It's fun.
Yeah. I think I read somewhere that Tamsin Muir said that she's convinced that that there's enough clues in these books for people to figure out the entire thing. Just in like the first two.
Wow.
We'll never get the whole story, but maybe if you took everyone's theories and put them together, we would have something close to what is actually going on. But I love that she's dropping all these clues, even in the first book, that aren't even clues until you've read Harrow. And then you're like, oh, that was a clue to something that isn't even revealed in Harrow. But that plus something in Harrow is a clue to something in Nona or Alecto.
Yep.
Anyway, we should get to chapter 33.
Yeah. Wow, we spend so much time.
Oh, brother. All right, the 6th and the 9th run into the 8th. Silas is actually kind of freaked out. I love the line that says, Silas, who could not be accused of having the milk of human kindness running through his veins. Ugh, it's a good line.
It's a good line.
Silas says that the third has defiled Abigail's body. They follow them to the morgue, and Pal freaks out because he realizes that he thought that when Abigail and Magnus went down into the facility, they were immediately killed. But actually what happened is they went down, they did a challenge, they got a key, they came back, and they were killed then.
Yep.
So he exclaims that his timing was wrong, and it looks like Abigail or someone else had hid the key that they had won in Abigail's stomach, I believe, right? Like in her abdomen?
Yeah, her abdomen.
Pal says that he knows what room the key opens. He's put it together that it's the room that they ungunked the lock for. Because they never opened that room. They just cleared out the lock.
Right.
So everyone traipses off to that room together. So we've got the 8th house, the 6th house, and the 9th house all together.
This is also where we learn that Octokizaron has never even tried to figure out what's happening here.
Like, he never used the keys that he got from Dulcinea.
He never used the keys, and Palamedes calls him an intellectual cretin and a dog in a manger.
Yeah.
And again, this is why I think going back maybe a couple episodes ago, we had a question around why did Dulcinea give Octokizaron her keys? And this is another reason why I think she gave them to him, because she knew he wasn't going to do anything with them.
Yeah.
And that he would, out of his own morals, as twisted as they are, fight anyone who tried to take them from him or do anything with them.
Right.
And so feeling like it was much easier for him to be the keeper of the keys than for her.
Yeah.
And I think there's a line at the very end. I often wonder why this chapter is even separated out.
Right, because it's
like,
really
it's
short.
like 4 pages, but it's almost a little, it's like in transit, you know, where they learn a little bit more and it's just building up some suspense.
We're about to hit the climax, and this is the transition chapter.
Yeah, chapters 34 and 35 are some of the best chapters for the big moments.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, that's what's going on.
Right.
I mean, it's kind of incredible that it's not until, you know, almost 400 pages that you're like, oh, now I know what's going on here.
It completely makes no sense until chapter 34 and 35, and then the rest of the book is just a fight.
Yeah. Which is hilarious. Like, again, hilarious. But I think if you have held on this long, then by the end, Tamsin Muir could do whatever she wanted in those last few chapters.
Yeah.
You know, she wanted to draw out like a wild fight scene. She can do that, and she did.
Yeah, and does it well.
But at the very last sentence of this chapter, they are talking about the ashes that were found in the incinerator. And they come to the conclusion that half of it is the 7th Cavalier, but the other half is someone else. So just confirming Ianthe's claim that there are 2 folks who were in the incinerator. And Palamedes says, we can't do anything for them yet. The living have to take precedence here if we want to keep living. And as it turned out, he was wrong. And what does that mean? Does it mean that it's really that killing their cavaliers allows them to keep living? Like, what was he wrong about? The living have to take precedence here if we want to keep living.
Because Cytherea is technically, like, not alive and not... She's dying. It could mean, like, she should have taken precedence. They should have been paying attention to her.
Right.
But basically that they're not going to solve anything by figuring out what's going on with the people who are alive. It's the mystery can be solved by who's died and how.
Right.
That's how I read it.
Right. Yeah.
If anyone has other interpretations, I also read that line and I'm kind of like, interesting. I don't really know exactly what that's referring to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great way to end that chapter, though, because that is like the perfect then transition into just the shitstorm that is 34 and 35. Woo!
Yes. Yeah, buckle up.
34, the chapter of Ianthe, Tridentarius, some of just, we get a preview into Harrow. I love it. It's so good.
We could never have known, even reading this book all the way through, we could never have known what a, like, twisted delight Ianthe is. But this is a little bit of a taste. Because they show up at that door that had the canyon painting outside and they had ungunked the lock. I think it's Cytherea's rooms, right?
Yeah, and I like how in the beginning there is obviously nerves. Everyone's a little nervous to go into the room. Mm-hmm. And the door is closed and everyone's like, oh, I don't feel any wards. And Harrow's like, oh, it's a lure. And Palamedes is like, oh, it's carelessness. And Gideon's like, no, y'all, they just didn't give a shit because the key is still in the lock. It's like you have these necromancers that are supposed to be super detail-oriented and observant. And Gideon's just like, guys, the key's in the lock.
I don't care.
Which is very Ianthe. Doesn't give a shit.
Yeah, I mean, at that point, she knew she was lyctor.
Yeah.
She knows that she would be too powerful for them to face her. Although turns out that she's not quite fully a lyctor yet. They go in, Ianthe, just to sum it up, Ianthe has killed Naberius Tern and has taken in his soul to become a lyctor. Corona's on the ground crying.
And Gideon's looking around and observing the room. And this room is one reason why we know this to be Kithire's room is because it's a very beautiful, cared for room with fanciful things. And I think earlier she describes the seventh house as, appreciating beauty in kind of fucked up ways, right? Because they also really love prolonging this weird blood disease that they have in their house. But this room is noticeably different and more fanciful than any of the other rooms that they've been in. Less practical and more just aesthetically nice. But then there's this really jarring message painted over kind of the mural that's on the wall. And it says, "You lied to us," in like black paint. And we'll come back to that.
Yeah, it's kind of, I don't know, it seems very teenager of Kithire to come in here and be like, "You lied to us," and then we'll come up the door.
I mean, she is not well. And I remember, I was reminded, because now I'm rereading Harrow in preparation for season 2 of our podcast. But after fighting the heralds at one point, she goes mad. Or like was never the same after. And so I think, to your point, Amy, that you made a few episodes back around some things Kithire does just doesn't really make a lot of sense. And clearly she's a little off her rockers, there is a logic to what she's doing. And there's also some stuff that's just like, she's been alive for 10,000 years. She's been traumatized by the resurrection beasts. And so she gets to Canaan House. She goes to her room. It's the first time she's back in 10,000 years. The man that she's followed and loved for all of this time is an asshole liar. And so she takes black paint and writes, "You lied to us," on her wall in like a rage. That's what I'm imagining.
Yeah, I imagine her seeing Gideon's eyes out on the terrace, realizing this, and then going to her room and writing this. But Ianthe doesn't seem to really, I don't know what Ianthe knows at this point about that, but she's become a lyctor, but she's kind of struggling because Naberius Tern didn't go willingly. It seems like he's kind of fighting her inside
fighting
of
for
her.
Control of her body, I think.
Yeah, or at least not wanting to listen to her, whatever is left of him. And it's interesting because Ianthe's like, "You guys didn't see me and you didn't respect me or didn't think I had this in me, but I was better than you the whole time." And then she says to Harrow, "You noticed me." And Harrow says, "You knew about the beguiling corpse. You knew how impossible it was." And this refers to Protesilaus?
No, I think this refers to the bone servants.
Well, because remember in that conversation when Dulcinea was explaining to them this fake hypothetical story about how everyone in her house got together to bring Protesilaus back as and then Ianthe's like, "That's not remotely how it works." And then Harrow notices her.
I see. Yeah, totally. I see. Yeah. So I think maybe that was the point then that Harrow realized, because there was that weird scene where Ianthe is like, "That's not possible." Ianthe leaves.
Right.
And then Harrow's kind of zoned in on her. And then like even follows her out into the hallway and watches her go. I feel like that was a turning point for Harrow where she realized that Ianthe was much smarter than what anyone had thought.
Right. What I don't get about this is I don't understand why, if they realized that Dulcinea was full of shit when she said that, why didn't they suspect Dulcinea more? I don't really get that bit. Anyway, we don't have to really go over it, but I just thought it was weird. Palamedes does say that he came to the same conclusion, but discarded it as ghastly and obvious. So he has kind of known. As smart as Ianthe is, I think that both Palamedes and Harrow kind of had it in them to know, but just couldn't imagine that that was what it was.
Right.
Because it's messed up.
Right. And I think the other reason why, now I'm looking at my notes, the other reason I think why Harrow knew Ianthe was more than what she appeared is because the puppeting requires energy transferal.
Right.
And what they don't know is that actually Ianthe specializes in energy transferal, the place between life and death, a liminal magician, right? And
is this the first liminal we get?
Yes. And and it's interesting. I had to reread this multiple times and pull out a dictionary because I was like, define occultist, define liminal magician, right? but basically, they thought she was a flesh magician, and I think Palamedes says animophiliac, and that was just for show. Ianthe says so. She was on purpose hiding her true self and her, her true potential, and also is so used to using Coronabeth as a shield because she's such a dominating presence.
Right.
But because Ianthe has studied where the soul goes when we knock it about, where the things are that eat us, all of these things, she's able to reverse engineer this whole process because this is like legitimately her specialty and what she's devoted her life studying. And I think Harrow says something funny where she's like, you make that sound a lot more interesting than it really is, which, and then Ianthe's like, stop being such a bone adept or whatever. It's just these funny little, I find it fascinating that each necromancer has a different specialty from each of the houses, and it's fun. You see how vast this field is, the field of necromancy.
Yeah. And in Harrow, remember how Ianthe's obsessed with the stoma and the bottom of the river? This continues. We'll continue to see that Ianthe's really interested in energy transfer and the river and the space between the river and whatever is beyond the river. Liminal spaces.
Liminal spaces.
And in Harrow, I feel like liminal it's one of those words that I'm like, yeah, Tamsin Muir loves the word liminal.
I have to create a drinking game every time liminal is mentioned.
Yeah, it's a good word.
The other thing that comes out here is it's the first instance that we maybe start to understand eyes. What happens with the eyes between a lyctor and their cavalier when they ascend into lyctorhood. And I always get confused about the eye thing, about what's supposed to happen, and then what happens when it doesn't work exactly, and then also what happens in the case of God and Electo. And so I thought it could be helpful for us to break down the eyes a little bit here and talk about what's going on with Ianthe's eyes in this moment.
Well, I mean, I think because Naberius is fighting her, and the process is not complete, their souls are fighting. So it's kind of going from her color eye to his color eye, then just pure white. And I don't know if there's an exact logic to the eye change because there's some confusing stuff later on in Harrow that I don't really understand around eye color change.
I think that, though, in the way that lictorhood was meant to be achieved by the lictors themselves, that once they attained lictorhood, it was supposed to be that they have their cavalier's eye color.
Yes.
Right? That's what it's supposed to be. But in the cases where it's not fully achieved, so with Harrow, for example,
right,
the eyes only turn when the cavalier shows up fully present in the body. So when they go under in the river and then Pyrrha, for example.
Well, yeah. Well, we'll have to go over the Pyrrha Gideon thing in Harrow because I've never really understood which eye color is. If Gideon's eye color hadn't changed, wouldn't people have been like, yo, what happened? Your eyes are the same color.
Right.
But if they had changed, then why are they still... Anyway, let's go over that in Harrow.
It's confusing.
It's very confusing. But here, I think the point is that Ianthe does not have Naberius under control.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting because in Harrow, she continues to have issues with her eyes changing back and forth until she and Harrow and God and Mercy Morn go into the river to get to the Mithraeum. And I think Harrow makes a note that's like, eyes have not reverted since the river. So there's something about the river and having entered the river at eventually solidifies the process. And then when she gets her bone arm that Harrow makes, I think that is kind of final straw that Naberius kind of loses the weird battle.
Yeah. But here the eyes are described. We know something's going on there. We know that Naberius is fighting Ianthe. And then Ianthe walks us through the literal process for lictorhood, which is quite a few steps.
8, in fact.
8 steps. And it's funny, in preparation for this episode, I was trying to match each trial with each of these steps, and then realized that we didn't see all of the challenges.
Oh,
in
not
the
even
book.
close.
So, you know, we can make some of the matches, but actually not all of them, because different people had different parts of the puzzle here. But the fact that Ianthe put together the whole puzzle just from... She did the challenges after the fact without attaining the keys.
Yeah, I think it's kind of a combo. Because she didn't have her cavalier, she says you can't do the challenges alone. So what I'm assuming is that she was watching people do the challenges and then was like kind of doing what she could alone. But I think that she says that you can't do them alone. So she couldn't have done them fully. But I think that she kind of messed around with them, watched other people do them. Remember, the 4th was like, yeah, Ianthe is following everyone everywhere.
Right. So she's brilliant. And I think when Palamedes says that he came to the same conclusion and discarded it as ghastly and obvious, Ianthe's then like, ghastly and obvious are my middle names. And then she's like, use that big muscular brain of yours, Palamedes. I don't know. God, I love her so much.
She's just not concerned with morals.
No.
But she's very
not
smart.
At all. And there's this moment where there's this common sense shit that she says that's like, think about it. 10,000 years ago, there were 16 acolytes, and then there were 8. And then everyone's probably like, oh.
Yeah. Not too difficult to get. There's also some interesting moments with Palamedes here. First of all, Palamedes puts his back against the wall and touches where "You lied to us" is written, and he kind of freezes. We later learn that he's realizing using psychometry that Cytherea, Dulcinea, the person posing as Dulcinea, wrote this because he can put those two things together. And there's no way that Dulcinea could have been in this room. So he knows that Cytherea is not Dulcinea. So there's that. And then he also says to Ianthe, as she's explaining and kind of reveling in her victory, he's like, whatever you think you've done, you haven't done it. And I think he also says, this can't be right. And I think what he's realizing and what he's started working on is perfect lictorhood. And I think what he's basically saying is, you think that you've done lictorhood, and maybe you have done it the way the lictors have, but you haven't done it. Lictorhood as the lictors achieved it is kind of a weird fuck up of what it should be. It's like half lictorhood.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And I think Palamedes knows that. But then we don't really realize it until later. He disappears.
Yeah. And while he's gone, the nastiest, grossest fight. Ugh.
Honestly, when I was reading it this time, I don't know why this has never happened to me before reading this, but I was just like, this is horrifying. And as much as I like deeply want there to be an animated show based on these books, The Dream, I do not ever want to see this fight, animated or otherwise, on screen.
It's so there's something about me, I don't know if you know, is I hate like phlegm, spit. I'm really squeamish around that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And then I'm also can't handle like paper cuts and anything involving the skin.
Yeah.
I just get real yucked out. And so reading this was like all of that on steroids. And
It's so nasty.
You know, it's hard enough to imagine. I feel like finally, maybe my 4th now read through of this, I've slowed down reading and am really trying to sit in the descriptions of everything because there's so much there. And I did that for this fight so that I could really imagine what it was and just continued to get so nauseous.
It's so
reading
gross.
it. But it's gross because Ianthe is gross too, you know, as a character.
Yeah, as much as it's all for show, like she is a flesh magician as well, and it is nasty when she makes that weird fat bubble to protect herself.
Which is not dissimilar than Harrow's bone thing, but bones are much cleaner.
Yes, yeah, very pro bone. Like bone adept, I would be a bone adept over a flesh adept for sure.
Oh yeah,
I mean, obviously, I would want to be a spirit magician, but if we have to choose.
If we have to choose. I mean, so basically what happens in this fight, and we don't need to...
Let's not go into the gory details. It's disgusting.
We don't need to go into it too much. But Octokizaron, right, Silas is like, this is horrible, this is amoral, and is like, we need to kill Ianthe. Ianthe's like, you're an idiot, you can't kill me, I'm a lyctor. But instead, Colum goes after Ianthe, and it's very clear that he is not making any progress. She's just able to avoid him. Even when he does, I think the purpose, too, of this fight is to demonstrate to the reader the power of being a lyctor. When Ianthe does get, quote-unquote, injured, her body just sews back up.
Although I would say that throughout this fight, although Ianthe, I think, has the upper hand most of the time, she's really mostly fighting Naberius.
Right.
Like, this is a fight between Ianthe and Naberius with the distraction of Silas and Colum.
Right. Because she needs Naberius's skills in this moment to survive, but also doesn't want to give him too much control because he could overtake her.
Right. And I think that there's that moment where she almost loses the fight is when her eyes go white. No one's in control, really. And she puts herself in this giant flesh bubble to protect herself.
Yeah.
But if she hadn't, I wonder if they could have killed her.
Right. I mean, if there was a time to kill Ianthe, this would have been it. Spoiler, they don't kill Ianthe. Silas realizes that he needs to fight her. And so in doing so, he siphons Colum. But it requires so much energy that Colum is finally overcome by a demon. The thing that teacher has warned us of this whole time happens. And it's I missed, again, I think I sped read this the first few times because I was so grossed out by the fleshy stuff. But the description of what Colum turns into is also horrifying. It's like horror, right? We get more horror here than in other places in the book where his eyeballs are like,
oh my god,
mouths.
Yeah. I never forget that his eyeballs become mouths with tongues sticking out of them.
I feel like there's something in Star Wars that is similar to this, and I can't remember exactly what it is, but there's like some sort of monster.
Well, there's
character.
That giant thing in the desert that eats Boba Fett.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's, oh my god, I just cannot. I hated that part as a kid.
Yeah, so that happens, and Harrow, she throws some bones, tries to make a cage around what used to be Colum, and Colum's body just kicks it, and then finally Ianthe's like, all right, enough of this, kills Colum. Oh, I skipped the most wonderful part of this, which is that Colum kills Silas.
Yeah,
finally.
Everyone's completely overjoyed.
Yes. No more milkman.
Yeah,
that's fine. Silas and Colum both die, and shit kind of calms down for a hot second. Ianthe escapes through a flesh portal. I don't
understand that at all. There's this weird bit that happens in this. I feel like it's only this fight, and we never see it again in the rest of this book or in Harrow. But basically, Ianthe is teleporting through flesh portals. She'll fall into like a flesh puddle or like a blood puddle, and then she'll appear somewhere else.
Yes, I believe this sentence is deliquesced into a viscous puddle, leaving no trace of Ianthe, and my note on the side is, what the fuck is this?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like if that's a thing that they have in their playbook, I would be using that a lot more.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's curious. Maybe it will come back someday. I don't know. But anyway, if you want a more detailed version of this fight, this episode is not where you're going to get it. So
no, go read it again.
Sorry.
Like,
yeah.
Ooh, it's disgusting. But I mean, it's really well written. It's just like, if you think about what is happening, it is nasty. They get showered by like blood and lymph fat nastiness. I mean, it's gross.
Yeah.
And then they go at the end when Ianthe disappears. Gideon goes up to Corona, who's still just sadly crying on the ground, and is like, "Are you okay?" And Corona's like, "She took Naberius," and Gideon's like, "Yeah, fair. I mean, sorry." And Corona's like, "She could have taken me." And they're like, "Okay." Everyone just leaves Corona at that point.
And she's like, "Who even cares about Babs? She doesn't give a shit about him."
Yeah.
Ugh. Tragic characters all around. Just really messed up stuff.
Yeah. So they leave Corona Beth to her alien grief, and they realize that Palamedes has disappeared. Camilla finally reveals that Palamedes is in love with Dulcinea, and they've been writing to each other for years, and he proposed marriage and all of this stuff. And Gideon's just like, "Oh my God, I've been totally flirting with this person who Palamedes is actually very serious about." And Mel, she says, "Why was I born so attractive?" And Harrow's response is that
all right,
everyone would have strangled her otherwise, therefore implying that Harrow thinks that Gideon is attractive.
Yeah, that doesn't mean anything. Amy, I think you're attractive and we're not in love. I mean...
Well, thank you.
You know, objectively attractive, sure. No, I know. I thought actually that was cute. And
it's kind of just thrown in there. I feel like, whatever, I'm adding it to the pile.
Add it to your pile, that's fine. I'm not convinced, but that's fine. I think when we do Dr. Sex, we'll get more into Palamedes and Camilla's kind of relationship, and also Palamedes' relationship with Dulcinea a bit.
Right.
But the thing to note here is that Palamedes wrote Dulcinea when he was 8 years old, and Dulcinea, I think, was a teenager,
15?
Which is kind of weird. Kind of weird. But it wasn't romantic for her at that point. But she was very kind to Palamedes. We'll talk about that in a minute when we get to the reckoning.
I like to think that this started as a pen pal program.
A pen palamedes?
Wow. Whew. Should have saved it for episode 8. But I do think it's funny to think of, in elementary school, I don't even remember why, but we would get pen pals sometimes.
Totally.
And then you'd have a pen pal and you'd have to write them a letter. And I was always like so unimpressed. But I want to think that it started as this little program, like an inter-house cultural exchange.
Oh my God, totally. It's so cute. Wow, I totally forgot about the pen pal situation that I had in second grade, and you're right, that was a thing.
I don't remember who I was pen paling with.
It would be crazy if you and I were each other's pen pals and we found out now.
Oh my gosh. Someone from New York and someone from California? Such a cultural divide.
I mean, now that I know I have friends who are teachers now, I'm like, it's probably just teachers who were friends that worked at different schools that were like, let's have our kids write each other.
No doubt.
Yeah. But anyway, Camilla says, get up, Gideon. He doesn't hate you. You didn't ruin anything. They had never even met in person until this moment, until they both came here. So again, this is why Sextus didn't know.
It's weird that he would never have seen a picture of her, though.
Right.
It's also weird that they're so smart and that Dulcinea apparently tried to leave these clues and they didn't get it.
They were distracted.
I guess so.
And Cytherea, won an Emmy for her performance, so.
This is true.
But I had a question. So Gideon basically says, I need to go find him and apologize. Give me a couple moments alone with him. And then she says, Harrow, go get my two-hander. It's in the false bottom of my trunk. Why, at that point, does Gideon ask for her two-hander? She doesn't know about Cytherea. Like, what's going on? Is it just because shit's hit the fan and she wants extra? Or is it like, all bets are off now, everyone knows that everything isn't what it seems, and so just go get me my the sword that I've been wanting to yield this whole time.
Yeah, I think it's because of what she just saw. I mean, if I saw what had happened in Cytherea's room with Ianthe and Colum and Silas, I would also want my best sword. She knows that shit is hitting the fan.
Yeah.
Teacher is dead. Everyone is dead except for this absolutely wildly insane teenage lyctor girl.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess she's like 22. But anyway. And then them. Yeah, she wants her sword.
Right. Right. And and on that note, Gideon runs after Palamedes, and here is the moment where I thought Palamedes was the bad guy. And it's so well written and
I know
builds up so, oh my God. So basically she follows Palamedes. He is standing outside Dulcinea's door, and it looks like he's in thought, and Gideon is about to say to him, "I'm so sorry," when he turns around and he folds his fingers together. And that visual is so powerful. He folds his fingers together as you would a piece of paper. Her body stopped where it stood, as though steel needles had pierced her hands and her legs, and Gideon felt cold all over. In that moment, I think it's Palamedes this whole time.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And this is also, again, it's just a couple small paragraphs, but, you know, she struggles. She can't get out of this, however he's bound her. And Palamedes surveyed his work, and he saw that it was good, which is obviously a reference from Book of Genesis. And then he smiled, and with that strange alchemy, he was made lovely, his gray eyes bright and clear.
It also, just really quick, going back to the piercing the hands and feet, it's very much, again, Gideon as Jesus. Just one more, like, Son of God, sacrificing. So, a lot of, like, biblical references just right here.
Yeah, and then we get the experience.
Basically, Gideon is frozen. Palamedes, I think, purposefully leaves the door open so that Gideon will hear all of this, and he confronts Dulcinea. And he isn't like, "Oh, I know that you're not Dulcinea." He asks why the fifth house. And at this point, Cytherea knows that he knows. And she's like, the fifth necromancer, Abigail, was a historian, and I was afraid that she would figure me out. So that makes sense. And then she says that it's a good thing that she didn't realize how good Palamedes was with psychometry. And she says something that's really interesting that I don't really understand. She says she didn't know that he understood the ghost within the thing. 6 psychometry? What does that mean? What ghost within what thing?
Psychometry is partially about the ghost within the thing. It's like revenants, right? Things that are attached to objects, signatures, right? Thanergetic signatures or whatever. And so there's something that Ianthe said earlier, right? Which is that all of the signatures didn't add up in this place.
Mm-hmm.
Which I still am confused. I'm kind of hearkening back to when Palamedes was trying to date the room where the door to the laboratory was, right, and like what the discrepancies were. But basically, if he was able to tell that Cytherea had been here 10,000 years ago, like he would be picking up on her as she is today, and then also seeing that her presence was in this space also like 10,000 years ago, which I don't know.
Well, I guess I don't know. I understand like the ghost within the thing generally, but what specific thing is she referring to here that would have been scary to her if she had known?
That she has a soul within her body? I don't know. Teacher, right? The bone servants. I don't know. Because that's the one, that was her room. Wait, no, it wasn't. Bone
nerds, send us your theories.
Wait, We don't know.
We don't know. We can't solve them all. And then he says, where have you put Dulcinea? And this is the moment where, if you hadn't understood it already, you're like, oh, this is not Dulcinea. This is someone else. And this is where Cytherea kind of explains that she kept Dulcinea around for a long time. I guess dead Dulcinea, which is really pretty bleak. And they have this conversation about Dulcinea, and Cytherea's like, I thought you would be more distraught and like upset about this. And Palamedes is like, I would never do anything silly. I've been pushing your cancer along and making it worse, and now you're going to die in pain. And it's interesting because he says this and then he blows her up, but he says it as if he knows that blowing her up is not going to kill her, because what is the point of blowing her up? Or what is the point of pushing this cancer along and promising a painful death if he's just going to destroy her?
So I think ultimately, when we think about what actually kills Cytherea, it is what Palamedes did.
Well, it's a blade through the heart, right?
Yes, but him pushing along her cancer made it so that she could not heal properly. And so in blowing her up, he's essentially, and we see this right towards the end, which we'll talk about in our next episode, but when she dies, it's the wounds that were inflicted on her by him blowing himself up that ultimately make her bleed out. It's, it is the sword through the heart, but that alone wouldn't have killed her. It's the combination of all the other wounds that she had that could not heal because of his cancer.
At the very least, it definitely slowed her down enough that it gave them time to kill her. There's no way that they would have won if he hadn't done this.
Yep.
We're getting ahead of ourselves. Basically, Palamedes blows himself up.
And it is so sad.
Gideon is released from the binds. He does turn around to Gideon and says, Gideon, tell Camilla, oh, never mind, she'll know what to do. And we learn later that Camilla and Palamedes have already planned for Palamedes' death, and that he promised Camilla that he would tie his soul to his body, or he tied his soul to his body in a very specific way so that when he died, there would be a portion of his soul attached to his body, which I think is funny. Like I think it's later Harrow says that Palamedes found the idea of dying inconvenient. I feel like not even because he's afraid of dying, but just because he has a lot of work to do.
Yeah, it's his his will to live is around just intellectual curiosity.
Yeah.
He's such a nerd to the end and beyond.
Yeah.
But there's a lot that we learn here about Cytherea's motivations. Mm-hmm. And again, we get this, the question that Palamedes asks is, why would one of the Emperor's lictors hate him? And she's basically like, we don't hate him. I've loved this man for 10,000 years like a god and like a brother. I worshipped him. And we don't fully understand the reason yet why. Like, we know there's a reason, and we know that she's got complicated feelings. Mm-hmm. But that there was some major betrayal of trust, enough for her to orchestrate this whole thing.
Right.
And we also, this is here where we see that, Palamedes is like, I never would have gone through with lictorhood. I would never have done that to Camilla. And,
right.
It's explained that Cytherea and Loveday did decide to go through it because they thought it would make Dulcinea live, and Cytherea live.
Right.
But in fact, all it does is freeze you in time. And so she has experienced an immense amount of pain for 10,000 years. I mean, this is chronic pain.
I can't even imagine.
For 10,000 years. And then again, we see this reference to Teacher. Teacher was nearly demented. Did you know what we did to him? I say we, but he wasn't my project. You can thank your house for that. So it's fascinating. Palamedes' house's legacy in this instance is Teacher. And it's also not something Palamedes would ever have participated in himself.
Right. We learn later that Cassiopeia was actually like a pretty agreeable person, but apparently still, I don't know, it doesn't quite have Palamedes' morals.
No one's perfect.
No, definitely
except
not.
Palamedes.
Palamedes is pretty freaking good. At the very end of this chapter, Cytherea emerges from the wreckage of Calamity's bomb and says to Gideon, I'm Cytherea the First, lictor of the 9 houses, and I'm here to kill everyone, and it starts with you. And that's the beginning of the final fight, which we will cover in our next episode. Next episode is the end of the book. Wild.
It is. And I think I cried when Calamities blew himself up.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure. I was devastated by that.
Yeah, at this point, we didn't know that death is not quite death for many of these people. And I definitely cried when Gideon, well,
yeah. Spoiler. No.
But like,
not that we haven't mentioned that 32 times.
Like every episode. But yeah, it's really sad. It is really sad because I don't know if he'll ever he won't come back.
Have you read Nona excerpt yet?
Yeah, I know that he's like backing away, but he's never going to be like back.
Yeah, well, we have to change what we think of as back.
Yes.
There's something here. There's some theme that we can talk to maybe post Harrow about the body and soul and what makes you who you are.
Yeah.
Because there's a lot here that Tamsin is playing with, and that's all I'll say for now, because I think we could probably do a whole episode on gender and sexuality in these books.
Definitely.
Which maybe we should do.
Yes.
But yeah, I cannot believe that our next episode will be our last episode about Gideon the Ninth.
It's going to be good.
A little bit of a preview about what you can expect after we finish the next episode. We are going to do a little bit about the appendix of in Gideon. There's a lot to go through. There is the bit about the relationship between Cavaliers and lictors. There is the intelligence report that Judith writes for the second cohort. And then we will talk about Dr. Sex and do a little bit of, have a little conversation about Calamities and Camilla's relationship. Then we will move into what I believe to be the best book ever written.
I'm glad that you are on the Harrow train now.
Well, it's funny because when I finished Gideon the first time, I remember texting you and saying, Gideon is my favorite character I've ever read.
Yeah,
and I feel an immense sense of grief and loss. And I don't even want to read Harrow.
Yes. And I said, no, do it.
You were like, I think actually Harrow's my favorite character. And I was like, what the fuck are you talking about? And then you read Harrow and you're like, wow, I didn't think that could be topped. And yet somehow the second book tops the first, which I don't think I've ever experienced in a series before.
Yeah, it's good. So I guess tune in next time to finish out Gideon. It is a wild fight for the next couple chapters, and we'll cover the epilogue as well. And depending on how much time we get, we might touch the appendixes as well. But as always, thank you guys for joining us, and please rate and review us. And if you have any questions or comments, please go to our website, lockedtombpod.com, and send us a question there. You can also send us a question on Twitter if you so desire. We release episodes on Tuesdays most of the time, wherever you find your podcasts. So thank you guys so much for listening. And thank you, as always, to Olivia K for our theme music. I'm Amy.
And I'm Mel.
And we'll see you next time here at the Locked Tomb Podcast.